I am the chair of the advisory board of the Georgia Council for Restorative Justice. It's an organization that is committed to the principles of restorative justice. Restorative justice is a relatively new way of looking at the criminal justice system. I mean, I was trained, as virtually every lawyer I know was, to think of the criminal legal system as the state enforcing its laws against people who allegedly have offended against those laws, which of course is an accurate way of looking at the criminal justice system. But it's not the only way. And restorative justice is a way of viewing the criminal process very differently. Instead of focusing solely on the state and its laws and the defendant and whether the state can prove the defendant violated those laws, and therefore whether the state and to what extent the state will punish that person, restorative justice recognizes that crimes are about people and they're about relationships. And when somebody commits a crime, from what we think of as the relatively minor crimes right on up to the most serious crimes, that's a tear in the fabric of our society, of relationships. When people steal, when they hurt somebody else, it's true, society is hurt, but people are also hurt, and relationships and local communities are harmed by that. Restorative justice tries to take the perspective of who has been harmed here and what can be done to address that harm. And it can include giving victims of crime a much larger voice in the process. You know, the traditional criminal justice model is the state versus the defendant, and the victim of crime has very little, if no formal say in the process at all. Restorative justice is designed in part to give the victims of crime a much larger voice because they're the ones who've suffered most directly. Restorative justice also treats the offender more as a human being rather than just a defendant. To the extent the offender has needs to make right what he or she did wrong, restorative justice recognizes that that's an important need both for the individual and for the community to bring about some reconciliation and some recompense for, and that's actually a personal need to many defendants, to acknowledge the harm that they've caused and take steps to make it right. It's not going to work in every case, I realize, but there are many criminal cases in which both victims and offenders benefit from that kind of approach. The Georgia Council for Restorative Justice is designed to be a clearinghouse for various efforts in restorative justice that are going on right now throughout the state of Georgia, particularly in juvenile court, sometimes in school systems. A particular focus, though, of the Georgia Council for Restorative Justice has been in the most serious criminal cases. Many restorative justice efforts around the country are focused on misdemeanors. It's easier to get people together when the harm that's been done is not so great. Not that it's easy, I don't want to mislead. Even in misdemeanor cases, it can be quite difficult to bring about the kind of true communication and ultimate reconciliation that restorative justice aims for. I know a lot of people that say, well, in the very worst cases, the murder cases, restorative justice principles probably just shouldn't even be thought about. But I've learned a lot over the years from Howard Zier, who is really the father of restorative justice at Eastern Mennonite University, that restorative justice principles can be just as applicable in any criminal case, including the most serious. So the folks at Eastern Mennonite University, Howard Zier and someone, Tammy Krause, who was there, developed something called defense-initiated victim outreach for the most serious cases, those cases, murder cases, in which the state was seeking the death penalty. The idea was that defense lawyers were recognizing that victims, the survivors of homicide victims in particular, were being re-traumatized by the criminal process, especially when the state is seeking the death penalty against a particular defendant. The process lasts a very long time. People often go to court multiple times, and it gets delayed, and it's very frustrating for victims. Having to go into court and testify can be very traumatizing, to have to relive the events of the crime that brought the whole criminal case about. Defense-initiated victim outreach is designed to try to help the victims deal with the traumatic aspects of the criminal justice process. Not so much about dealing with the trauma of the event itself. The trauma is almost unimaginable for some families when they've lost a loved one to a murder. But at a minimum, at least try to minimize the extra trauma that might come through the criminal justice process. Well, how does it work? In cases in which defense-initiated victim outreach is used, there is a specialist who's appointed by the court to be a victim outreach specialist, not aligned with the prosecution, and although has lines of communication with the defense, is not part of the defense team either. It's someone who is there to help the victims learn more about the process, establish lines of communication with the defense team, help them, just give them information about what's going on, and to the extent the victims would like it, to have lines of communication with the defense team and even the defendant. That's not for every victim, and it should never be forced on any victim or victim's family member. But and it's been proven to work in several cases now, that it helps victims, the survivors of homicide, that is, the surviving family members for homicide victims, to work through the process in a way that they feel like they have a stake in it, that they know more what's going on, they can communicate with both sides of the process, and to the extent that they have a voice that needs to be heard about what their wishes are in the case, it can be conveyed to both sides in the process. So I've seen that it can work. One need, though, is to have more people who are trained in this very difficult and delicate work of working with survivors of these kinds of awful crimes. Parents, loved ones, children of people who've been brutally murdered have gone through tremendous trauma. Learning how to communicate with people who've been traumatized that way is not something that somebody can just do because, well, I'd like to go do that. So our organization provides extensive training that includes a good bit of work just in understanding trauma, work in understanding the criminal justice process and how it works, and also learning about how to communicate even in the midst of such emotionally difficult situations as we're talking about. And so we've trained at least 30 people now in the last couple of years who are available to serve as victim outreach specialists in murder cases, and that's been throughout the Southeast, and now we're expanding into Texas, where there's certainly plenty of need in the area of death penalty cases for this kind of work. And so I'm gratified to see that this organization it's a concept that's runs against the grain of the prevailing mindset of the way people look at criminal cases, especially capital cases. But it is taking hold, and more people are seeing the need for it, and I look for a lot of growth in this area. Death penalty cases are different than any other kind of case in the complexity of the trial and the appeal and everything involved, and it leaves victims kind of out in the cold more than any other kind of case, and they often get false hopes about what's about to happen, and then it doesn't happen. This is a way to people who've been through, the worst thing we can imagine, at least to minimize how the criminal justice system impacts their lives that way.